Okay, good morning, everybody. God is good, and all the time. All right. So, I have my father-in-law, Willie. Say hi, Willie. He's over there, and my son, Sebastian, is over there with him. So, in case you don't know, I'm from England. I immigrated to America in 1997. I came for 2 years, and I've been here ever since. And this month, just a couple of weeks ago, this happened. Look at that handsome guy. I got my first cowboy hat 2 weeks ago. Howdy. But I'm all hat and no cattle, so I'll stick with the fedora for most of it. Right? That's all Yeah. I'm a missionary's kid. My dad has a prayer card that he gives out that says Jesus Christ is 100% reliable, 100% of the time. Trust him. So I thought that was cool. I wanted to share that. Have you heard of Horatio G. Spafford? Some of you legacy guys have probably heard of him. Let me tell you a story about this guy. Horatio G. Spafford, 1828 to 1888. So it was a long time ago, but it still applies. He was a Presbyterian from Chicago. He was a successful attorney and real estate investor. Among his close friends were several evangelists, including the famous Dwight L. Moody, also from Chicago. I've heard the name, couldn't tell you anything about it. He was famous at the time. Spafford's fortune evaporated in the wake of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Having invested heavily in real estate along Lake Michigan's shoreline, he lost everything overnight. In a saga reminiscent of Job, his son died of scarlet fever a short time before his financial disaster. But the worst was yet to come. In November 1873, thinking a vacation would do his family some good, as well as wishing to join and assist Moody and his team in one of their evangelistic campaigns in Great Britain, he sent his wife and 4 daughters on a ship to England, planning to join them after he finished some pressing business at home. However, while crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the ship was involved in a terrible collision and sunk in 12 minutes. More than 200 people lost their lives, including all 4 of Horatio Spafford's precious daughters. His wife, Anna, survived the tragedy. Upon arriving in England, she sent a telegram to her husband that began, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" Horatio immediately set sail for England. At one point during his voyage, the captain of the ship, aware of the tragedy that had struck the Spafford family, summoned Horatio to tell him that they were now passing over the spot where the shipwreck had occurred. Undoubtedly filled with intense grief, in that moment, Horatio began to write words from his heart that were later given a melody. What he wrote was this. Do we have any singers in the house? Right here. Can you lead us in? Do you have a sheet? You don't have a sheet. What he wrote was this.
Do we have the melody?
When peace like a
When peace
like a river
when sorrows like sea billows roll.
Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Keep going. It is well with my soul. We can do that. It is well with my soul.
There's the singer.
We found him. So my subject, the card that I got today, was this. I would like to go deeper in the book of Job and truly learn about faithfulness in God after and during losing everything. Unwavering faith, hard or easy to have? Do we trust Him enough to be thrown into the fires of life and come out unharmed as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? I thought that was an easy subject for me to tackle, so just kidding. So I discovered this video by the Bible Project on YouTube that excellently breaks down the nuances of the book of Job in 11 minutes. So I want us to watch it together, and then I'll share some nuggets that I got from the book of Job before kicking it around the room.
Book of Job. It's a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man, and then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you bless him with prosperity. Let Job suffer, then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by 3 friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how this section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend. Then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now, Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent, and so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now, we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way, and so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, Job, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have a Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just, and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of: Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent, and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind, and he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours, it's extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. He starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile, but more likely they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God, and what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now, this is surprising because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling, how Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored, not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God, and that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God, and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
All right, what do you reckon? Pretty good. Okay, so as I was reading Job, I've never read the book of Job all the way through, and it was a struggle, honestly. But I got a handful of Easter eggs that I wanted to, like just my own things that impacted me, and then we'll kick it around the room because I think we can all learn a lot. So something that struck me at first was in Job chapter 1, Job's kids all got crushed when their house collapsed during a party. Like their house collapsed, they got buried alive pretty much. Tragic. Job got word of this accident, and I mean, a whole bunch of bad things had already happened. Then he lost his kids. And Job 1:20 says, "At this, Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, then he fell to the ground in worship." It struck me that that's probably the most ideal response to trauma, tragedy, grief, whatever we're going through. We lose our job, worship. If we get in a car accident, worship. You know, if you lose a family member, worship. Worship, to what I realized, was the secret sauce to walking through trials, trauma, grief, sorrow, because it flows from the heart, not the head. It builds faith and encourages the soul. A side note, those 3 or 4 friends that were speaking in Job's ear, they weren't really helpful. And so it struck me that we need to be careful who we listen to or seek counsel from when going through stuff. Because, like in the story, although Job's friends and even his wife were well-intentioned, their words were blamey, condemning, fleshy, confusing, and just really not helpful at all. So maybe we need to be careful who we have around us when we're needing friends. In Job 13:15, Job says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." This is a powerful declaration of faith. Job, despite his own suffering, expresses his unwavering belief that God is all-powerful and knows what is best, even if it means death. Something else that struck me was that Job was wrestling with God. I don't know if we feel free to wrestle with God, but I think it reminded me of me and my kid. Sometimes you got to cut teeth. You know, it's part of the growing process is the pushback, and you know, God's big enough to handle the wrestle. He wants us to wrestle. You know, seek and you will find. You know, knock, keep knocking. Don't give up until you get an answer. Job didn't get the answer he wanted, but he got the answer he needed. So, something that struck me later on in the book, you know, in Proverbs 3, one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, you know, it talks about, my son, do not let wisdom and understanding out of your sight. Preserve sound judgment and discretion. There will be life for you, an ornament to grace your neck. You will go on your way in safety, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Have no fear of sudden disaster or of the ruin that overtakes the wicked, for the Lord will be at your side and will keep your foot from being snared. Well, that's all about wisdom and understanding. I'm a smart guy, but I've never really found what is wisdom and understanding. You know, it's the thing that we're to desire most, but it's the most valuable thing ever. But what is it? Well, it dawned on me that in 28:28 of Job, it's right there. Job, it says, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to shun evil is understanding. So I thought that was pretty cool. And the other thing about wrestling with God is when God shows up and you get an encounter with God, it changes everything. Absolutely everything. So my encouragement to us is to wrestle with Him until we encounter Him. And with that, I'm going to kick it out.
Awesome. Thank you.